Basically, there's been a reaction against what I call the 4Ds of neoliberalism: deregulation by the state, particularly of the financial industry, conscious attacks by the state and by corporations to weaken union power, decreasing taxes on the wealthy and corporations, deregulation, deunionization, decreasing taxes, and defunding public goods. Increasingly arguing that the private sector provides things better than the public sector, and people should gain basic needs like healthcare or even education through privatization or quasi-privatization like charter schools. And obviously this has generated incredible inequality. I'm Joe Schwartz. I teach political science at Temple University. I'm an active member of the American Federation of Teachers, and probably in terms of political work, I was active in high school in the anti-Vietnam War movement, then the anti-apartheid movement. The problem with being on the left in America is you're often fighting the state, so you're anti-this, anti-intervention in Central America, but also the movement for single payer, and also I've been pretty involved in fighting for equitable, non-racist public education in Philadelphia, and the fight for affordable housing, which is obviously a huge issue in LA and any major city in the country. I want to talk about Sanders partly as an electoral expression of growing global rejection of growing inequality and austerity, what people on the left often call neoliberalism, and I will define that shortly. But this is not an accident. In other words, the resistance to neoliberalism basically was an argument that with sort of the growing power in the 60s and 70s around the world of the labor movement for Black and Latino rights in the United States, the environmental movement, corporate profits were being squeezed. And there basically was an effort, the left, particularly in places like Chile or France or Sweden, said, unless we gain greater democratic control over investment, over wealth, corporations are going to go on a capital strike. And what corporations said is, we're going to go on a capital strike until the economy is deregulated, particularly the financial sector. That is, the democratic state shouldn't restrain what corporations do, also in regards to environmental practices. That the global corporate world became much more hostile to unions, even in Western Europe, where they had basically made some degree of sort of concessions to the labor movement. And that the corporation said we needed to cut taxes on corporate profits and on the rich to free up entrepreneurial investment, et cetera. And we also need much less restrictions on trade and global investment. And that really has been the regime we've been living under the last 40 years. You might call it a race to the bottom, because corporate, sort of the global transnational corporate class basically said, we want to scour the globe for sort of the lowest labor standards, the lowest wage workers, the lowest environmental standards, and we're going to discipline workers in the more advanced democratic capitalist societies to compete with workers who are being oppressed around the world. And if you think I'm sort of making this up, John Reed, not the John Reed of the Russian Revolution, but John Reed, the CEO of Citibank in the late 80s, said American workers have to realize that they're in competition with Brazilian workers. What John Reed didn't tell you is that, and they have to lower their wages and benefits to Brazilian levels. Well, what he wasn't saying is that means that we're going to have a radical decline in living standards. Now, the economy did grow, and we'll talk about this, I'll talk about this briefly. Since 1979, gross domestic product and productivity has doubled, but the average family wage has only gone up 23%, with an increase in the working hours of families, because there are many more two adults working in a household, going up 35%. So what happened? How did all this growth happen? Mostly through asset bubbles, where the benefits went to the top 1% and increasingly the top 1/10 of 1%. In fact, half of the growth in income in the last 35 years has gone to the top 1%, and 90% of the growth to the top 10%. Those who really own assets, who have considerable investments in stocks and bonds, and obviously the big wealth went to hedge fund managers, because it's sort of like pumping up a balloon with sort of debt and sort of asset bubbles. To keep the economy growing, you had to have sort of the savings and loan crisis, the sort of merger and acquisition sort of race in the 80s. Then this is what Bill Clinton often takes credit for. You have a brief period of growth, but mostly based on the internet stock bubble of the late 90s. And then, of course, you had the housing bubble of 2001 to 2007. And then when that crashes, basically global corporate elites tried to make the price for that deflation of the economy on working people rather than the banksters. And that's really what has generated the reaction that has led to the rise of, say, left-wing parties like Podemos in Spain, Syriza in Greece, much of the energy of the Arab Spring, the pink tide of left-wing governments in Latin America. But it's very hard to really achieve, as you well know, sort of even social democracy or sort of a strong sort of labor movement, social welfare sort of policy in just one state. And in fact, one of the great crises in sort of for the global left is that unless the Northern European sort of, social democratic left and parties to the left really express much greater solidarity with Southern Europe, even the governments of Greece and Spain and Portugal, which now has a center-left government, have very little room to maneuver. So we'll talk about that. But basically, there's been a reaction against what I call the 4 Ds of neoliberalism: deregulation by the state, particularly of the financial industry, conscious attacks by the state and by corporations to weaken union power, decreasing taxes on the wealthy and corporations, deregulation, deunionization, decreasing taxes, and defunding public goods. Increasingly arguing that the private sector provides things better than the public sector, and people should gain basic needs like healthcare or even education through privatization or quasi-privatization like charter schools. And obviously this has generated incredible inequality. Now, the right and even the center in the United States says, well, where did this inequality come from? It's really the rise of the knowledge economy, and it's basically, the fancy term is skills-based technological change, that basically you have to have a college education to do well. But the wages of college graduates have been stagnant over the last 15 years. The only reason why it, quote, pays to get a college education is that the average high school graduate, men, have seen a 20% drop in their income over the last 30 years. And in terms of real wages, women about 8% more because they have a little more presence in, say, the healthcare sector, but their wages have also been stagnant. So instead of in some ways, and this is why there's a lot of anger among older white working and middle strata people, particularly men, because of deindustrialization, and why you see a growth of support among the white working class in particular for Sanders, but also for Trump, is during what was called the Great Compression, 47 to 73, which is a very unusual period, but a period of growth and sort of struggle by blacks and Latinos in the 60s to be included in that growth. Productivity doubles, the GDP doubles, and average family wage goes up 90%. Since 1979, productivity doubles, the GDP doubles, but average family income, as I said, goes up about 25%, and people are working 35% more hours, and Americans obviously work more than anyone else. And this has given rise to, Bernie didn't fall from the sky. Occupy, in some ways, was, though somewhat racially diverse, primarily a white college graduate movement, but it was really the revolt of the baristas. People who had college educations but could not get real career jobs. And hint, many people who are 5-10 years out of college have very heavy debt, but don't really have career jobs with good benefits and a clear career path. And they're delaying, and this is a big deflationary sort of weight on the economy. They're delaying partnering up. They can't afford houses. They're not buying houses. They're not having children, whatever. And that's going to be a real sort of dead weight on the economy for generations to come. And this has generated 2 phenomena that we really have to think of, and they're sort of connected. One is a left-wing populism, which I think Sanders epitomizes. And I'll talk a bit about why Sanders is running more on what we'd call a left liberal or social democratic program. He's not calling for worker ownership of the means of production. And Bernie comes out of a left-wing background. He does, when he said he's not for state ownership in his speech on socialism, where he said it's basically the Great Society and New Deal, notice he didn't say I'm against worker ownership. He said he's against state ownership. Bernie comes out of he was in the YPSL when it was sort of pretty anti-Stalinist, but fairly radical and fairly into workers' control. And there are quotes from when he was mayor of Burlington: if he does get the nomination, wait for the red baiting to really get going. He's already been charged with being too pro-Fidel, too pro the Sandinistas, but there's plenty of, I'll read you a quote if you don't believe it, but Bernie did say, as mayor of Burlington in 1988, he said, a socialist society is where human beings own the means of production and work together rather than having to work as semi-slaves to other people who can hire and fire them. That is, Bernie Sanders does know that socialism is worker ownership of the means of production, but he's not running on that platform, and he's basically, at first he was saying socialism is Denmark, and then when Clinton and Anderson Cooper pulled their nativist US stuff, oh, we're not going to be like the Danish, and they're all homogeneous, even though 14% of Denmark was born abroad, and there are huge immigration problems in Scandinavia, but they are not homogeneous societies. Just ask the 10% Finnish minority in Sweden what they think of Sweden, of Swedes. Just ask the Swedish minority in Finland what they think of Finns. It's like Anglos are taught all these myths. Canada is more social democratic because it's homogeneous. Just tell that to anybody who's from Quebec. 25% of Canada does not think they're Anglo-Canadian, right? It's a very diverse society with a lot of indigenous rights movements. 5% of Canada is indigenous. There was genocide, but it wasn't as extensive as in the US, and there's stronger native indigenous rights there. They have universal health care, and they're a diverse society. 8% of Canadians are either of African descent or Asian descent. It's not a homogeneous society, but that's what you're taught, right? We're too diverse to have socialism. No, we're true capitalists to be socialist, and we'll come to that. So anyway, the Sanders phenomenon really is, in some ways, part of an international movement, but it's the first time that really, in a certain sense, American exceptionalism is being challenged. Not that there aren't problems with Northern European sort of mixed market capitalist economies heavily influenced by a social democratic and labor tradition, but Bernie knows that Northern Europe has half the poverty rate of the United States, 1/3 the child poverty rate, twice as much social mobility, and for two reasons, really. They have universal health care, universal child care, and paid parental leave, but also, and this is what people in the United States don't know, we're the least taxed society in the advanced world and the most regressively taxed society. In other words, a lot of our taxes come from property taxes. You know that from Prop 13 in California if you're older. Sales tax, our flat rate Social Security and Medicare tax. Working class people are right. They do get taxed heavily in the US. But the affluent and corporations don't. If you think I'm sort of telling you a tale, the average member of the western part of the European Union, the more affluent societies starting from Italy going north, spend 45% of their GDP. They funnel it through state provision, and they only spend 2% of their GDP on defense versus us close to 10%. The United States only spends 34% of its GDP on, in the public sector. We underfund schools, but we don't have universal child care, paid parental leave that the states subsidize, and we don't have universal health care. Truly universal health care. 50% of our health care dollar comes through the state, but in Europe it's much higher. So we really have a very weak state. We also have a very inegalitarian state because federalism means that the more racist the states, in the South, social welfare provisions are very poor, unemployment insurance is very poor. To get the New Deal passed, basically FDR gave in to Southern white plantocracy Democrats. And basically, it's the states that control Social Security eligibility, not Social Security, unemployment eligibility, disability eligibility, what used to be AFDC, now TANF. Basically, Sanders is criticizing this inequality. And basically, his campaign is saying the race to the bottom has to stop. And one way of doing this is by taxing fairly the top 1% and corporate America. We also have to get rid of the oligarchic nature of American politics, right? The top 1/10 of 1/100th of 1%, I'm sorry, not top 100, gives 40% of campaign contributions. The New York Times ran a story with the pictures of the homes. 148 families are responsible for 50% of super PAC money. We spend about $10 billion a year on electoral politics. It's not humongous, but we spend $10 billion. What's really a danger is we also spend $10 billion a year. Corporate America spends 90% of it on lobbying, right? K Street is as big a problem as campaign funds. But campaign contributions obviously disproportionately come from the affluent. Bernie is an exception to that. And you don't have to be a democratic socialist or a left-wing professor. You just have to be Benjamin Page, a political scientist from Northwestern, and Marty Gillens, a mainstream political scientist from Princeton, to write an article in the American Political Science Review saying we are an oligarchy, because the policy preferences of Congress line up with the preferences of the top 1%, not with the average voter, right? Political scientists always say the median voter determines public policy on issues like trade, tax policy, regulation of the finance industry. The preferences of the 1% win. And the preferences, ordinary people are for raising the minimum wage to $15, are for fair trade agreements that support higher labor standards and environmental standards, and would say we'll only trade with China if Chinese workers have the right to organize, etc. Free trade wins, not fair trade. It's only the elites that are really for the TPP or for NAFTA. Most ordinary Americans think that banks should be more regulated, the big banks should be broken up. They're for restoring Glass-Steagall, but that doesn't happen. Bernie's also saying we have to expand the public sphere. He's for universal child care, but also, one of his more radical programs is universal free college tuition in state institutions, and he would use a financial transaction tax to fund higher ed. I could go through the rest of his program. I think what's significant is obviously opposition to TPP and earlier to Keystone, and he's really talking about climate change as being a key global justice issue. He supports the DREAM Act, etc.